Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Marcia.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we have an interview with a guest that we're very excited about. Samuel Clowes Huneke is an award-winning historian of modern Europe and associate professor of history at George Mason University. His book, I Will Not Abandon You: Queer Women in Nazi Germany, was published this year and will be the topic of our conversation today. So welcome, Professor Samuel.
Thanks for having me on.
So we'll get right into the questions. In the introduction of your book, you touch on the topic of your own identity and the way it intersects and doesn't with the topic of your book, Queer Women. And it was interesting to me that you addressed that because I've noticed it come up more often these days. Obviously, we have a history podcast, so we talk about the books we've read at length with other people. This idea that someone with a shared identity with the topic might be better equipped to write about that identity. And I wonder if you could talk a little about that. Did it impact your approach at all? What was the reason you felt compelled to address it?
Yeah, I think over the last, 20, 30, 50 years, there's been an increased interest in kind of identity-based studies and identity-based histories. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that traditionally history was, sort of elite white men. And so all of these other people who didn't see themselves in this kind of history writing started to write the histories of all these marginalized groups, in some ways sort of starting with histories of women, histories of non-white people, histories of working class people, and so on and so forth. And, this history writing was an important part of how these groups came to create and assert a kind of group identity, right? And so that's very much true for queer people. The way that we historically, over the last kind of 50 years, have created a common sense of identity and social place and culture for ourselves is through writing and reading and engaging with our history. So it's really sort of tied up in this very emotional way. At the same time, as a professional historian, where I went and got a PhD, I do this for a job. There's sort of a resistance to that idea, right? There's this idea that the study of history is sort of scholarly and it's scientific, it's objective, and it shouldn't have anything to do with politics or contemporary concerns. And obviously, that's sort of a artificial view, but it is in some ways how I was trained as a historian. And so these two things, when I actually sit down to write books like this, sort of come into conflict. On the one hand, this is a topic I'm deeply interested in, both as a queer person and as a historian of modern Germany. At the same time, I'm very cognizant of the fact that for queer women, especially queer women in Germany, this history is deeply important to them as people. This isn't academic. This isn't a matter of sort of scholarly interpretation. This is sort of wrapped up in who they are. And so I didn't want to decide not to write this book for that reason, but I thought it was really important to step back and talk, my reader through the kind of thought process of why is this so significant and why should an author at least sort of have this on their mind and be willing to address it. And I think it also has to do, it's in some sense wrapped up in conversations about cultural appropriation and the sort of straw man argument about cultural appropriation is, oh, well, I guess we're not allowed to, be inspired by other cultures anymore. And I think that's not what the argument is intended to be. It's much more about people kind of swooping in and claiming credit for what another culture has produced. And so in this case, I really wanted to emphasize that I know that this is something that's really important to people who belong to a community that I am kind of adjacent to, but not part of. And moreover, to really give credit to all of the feminist and queer historians who came before me and made it possible for me to write the book that I did.
Why women instead of men?
A couple reasons. The sort of central one is that there wasn't a law that criminalized female homosexuality in Nazi Germany. And I sort of stumbled onto this topic serendipitously. I was doing research for my dissertation, which became my first book about gay men in post-war Germany. And I came across these 4 files in the Berlin Regional Archive, each one detailing a lesbian couple or alleged lesbian couple who was denounced to the Nazi police as lesbians. And as soon as I saw those, my ears perked up and I thought, wait a minute, this wasn't illegal. There wasn't a law. What are the police doing investigating these women for doing something that isn't illegal? And I wrote an article about it. I kept researching it because the topic had grabbed me. And really, at base, one of the central questions was, how does a persecuting society like Nazi Germany treat an outsider group for which it does not have a clear policy or law that dictates how they're going to treat that group? And so, with gay men, we sort of already know what that story is. We know that there was a law against male homosexuality. We know that about 50,000 men were prosecuted under that law in the Nazi period. We know that about 10,000 men were sent to the concentration camps, where many of them wore a pink triangle. And the history of lesbianism and queer women wasn't as well known. It wasn't as well researched. And so that kind of conundrum is really what grabbed me about the topic.
You went down a rabbit hole.
I really did. I went down a side quest.
So can you talk a little bit more about the difficulties of researching this topic in particular? Because I know there are some things that are, the ground is very well trod, and this obviously is not.
Right, right. So again, I really want to emphasize I benefited from a lot of important work that was done on this topic by generations of lesbian and feminist historians going all the way back to the 1970s, when many of them sort of activist historians started looking for evidence of lesbian experiences in the Nazi period. Essentially, my method was to look for police records and court records of the Nazi state actually kind of uncovering queer women and trying to figure out, what do we do with this person or this couple. And so what I would do is I would go to or write to different regional archives around Germany. These are the archives that hold police records and court records, and essentially say, do you know of any files that might be relevant? And the difficulty here is that, unlike gay men, where you can write to them and say, I want to see all of your paragraph 175 cases. Paragraph 175 was the law that criminalized male homosexuality. And all of those files are labeled that way, and they're very easy to find and access. Conversely, because queer women were investigated and prosecuted under a whole gamut of different sort of non-consistent laws, some women might be prosecuted for causing a public nuisance, others might be prosecuted under laws dealing with sex work and prostitution. And so really it's up to whether or not archivists properly labeled these files as having something to do with female homosexuality. And so I'd write to these archives, and sometimes the archivists would write back and say, well, everyone knows that lesbians weren't persecuted, and so no, we don't have anything. And I would sort of say, okay, thank you for your time. That is not helpful. But then many times archives would get back to me and say, yes, we have 1 or 2 or 3 files. Typically, they were very generous and were willing to scan it and send it to me. In some cases, they had a couple dozen files, and then I would actually go in person and read through all of these files. But it really was a matter of kind of looking for needles in haystacks. And then in some of these cases, particularly the stories that I decided I really wanted to focus on in the book, I would go to other archives and try to kind of trace the life stories of these women and figure out both what had happened to them before they came to the attention of the Nazi police, and then what happened to them after they were let go or convicted or sent to a concentration camp, as the case may be.
So many of them, I think, aren't yet digitized, are they?
They're unevenly digitized, but in general, you need to go in person, unless, again, if it was sort of 1 or 2 files, in some cases they would just scan it and send it to me. In some cases I had to pay, and so if it was like a 10-page file, I might pay $20 or $30 to have it scanned and sent to me. That seemed worth the cost compared to a flight to Germany from the US. But again, in some cases, if it was many files, it wouldn't have made sense to try and do that. And so I actually went and got to read them in person. And, sometimes this maybe makes me sound like a bit of a fuddy-duddy, but I really do like reading these files in person. When I'm there, I always take notes. I really don't like this sort of modern practice of just taking photographs of everything and thinking, well, I'll read it and take notes on it later, because you get something oftentimes from physically handling the paper, from actually seeing, the context of how is it written, what is the letterhead, also just where is it stored physically in the file. Not always does it give you anything, but it sometimes can give you important context clues. And moreover, I think there's this quality that the novelist Hilary Mantel would talk about, of being able to feel the past through your skin. And I think that there really is something about that when you're actually touching the same paper that the people who you're writing about touched or wrote themselves. It allows you to, I think, have a deeper sympathy with their experiences and ultimately write more convincingly about them.
I was fascinated to read about how Weimar Germany and Berlin in particular was a sort of hub of queer culture in Europe
Hmm.
prior to Hitler's rise to power. And it's just so interesting to see kind of that level of liberation ish and then the brutal backlash that obviously follows. So, can you take us through how that happened and why the ensuing reversal was so intense? I suspect some might see some similarities with some of the current backlash against trans rights, although obviously it's not a one-to-one comparison.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So, Germany occupies this really kind of strange place in the history of queerness. I mean, some people sort of say Germany is where modern sexual identities are invented. And in some sense, that's correct. I mean, the word homosexuality is a German invention from the 1860s. The word transvestite, which for a long time is how trans people were referred to and referred to themselves in this period, it didn't have the same derogatory connotations that it does today. That is also a German word invented by the progressive sexologist and reformer Magnus Hirschfeld. So it intellectually is really important. It has these burgeoning queer subcultures starting in the 19th century. Also in the 19th century, you start having homosexual rights groups, kind of the first like gay liberation movements, if you want to think about it that way. In 1919, when the Weimar Republic gets started, Germany's first real experiment with republican democracy after World War I, the sort of queer scene just grows exponentially. You have clubs and bars and publications. You have more and more of these rights groups. There are actually a couple trans rights groups that are founded in this period. And it really is seen as sort of the locus of queer culture in the world. Christopher Isherwood, who is best known for Cabaret, obviously, famously wrote when he visited Berlin in the late 20s, early 30s, that Berlin meant boys, right? It was this sort of hedonistic queer place. Of course, the Nazis in part campaign against that. They see the Weimar Republic as this sort of libertine, decadent place. For them, it's associated with women's rights, with feminism, also, of course, with their anti Semitic view of the world. And they clamped down on it very quickly. My colleague Lori Marhofer wrote a really wonderful book about this backlash specifically. And he argues that while there was this backlash, it didn't actually drive people to vote for the Nazis. This is sort of still an open point of contention among historians of this period. But whether or not that's sort of a reason that the Nazis rose to power, what is undoubtedly true is that they saw themselves as kind of morally purifying what they viewed as the decadence of the Weimar Republic. When it comes to trans rights today, I think, the comparisons unfortunately write themselves. I think there's similarly kind of an open question about, is this actually a good electoral sort of path for the right to be doing this? Is it actually getting them votes? I don't know. I haven't seen any sort of convincing analysis one way or the other. At the same time, it's clear that right-wing groups are positioning themselves as, trying to clean up a kind of moral degeneracy or error in their view in terms of the embrace of trans rights and trans people. And I think the comparison is deeply disturbing. My only kind of hope is that these things aren't criminalized in the way that they were even in the 1920s, even in the Weimar Republic. They are much more a part of a public conversation that ordinary people are engaged in than they were in the 1920s or early 30s. I think many more Americans today know a trans person or a gay person or a lesbian or whatever than, the equivalent would have in the early 30s. And so I do have hope that we aren't going to see the same exact kind of backlash, but I do think the fundamental components are there.
Yeah, scary stuff.
Yeah, not cheery.
Yeah. One of the things that I found really unsettling when I was reading was that because these women existed in this kind of gray space
Mhm.
within the law, it wasn't like a guarantee that you get arrested, you're going to be charged with this, whatever, whatever. A lot of the times, what it would do was just put a target on their back. So you're going to have the Gestapo watching you, you're going to be followed, you're
Mhm.
going to be harassed, all this kind of stuff. And you're just living in this uncertainty and you don't know what's going to happen to you. I'm wondering if you could tell us kind of how more broadly, what was the treatment like for queer women, even outside of Germany at the time? Like, how would have this
Mm,
compared to what people were going through
mm.
elsewhere?
That's a really good question. First and foremost, it is very typical of most countries that female homosexuality wasn't explicitly criminalized. In most countries, whether or not they had sodomy statutes, in general, female homosexuality would not have been part of that law. One of the actual kind of notable exceptions is Austria, which had a law that criminalized both male and female homosexuality. When the Nazis take over Austria in 1938, they actually keep that law on the books in Austria. And historians who study this history have documented cases after 1938 of lesbian women continuing to be prosecuted under the law, even after the Nazi annexation. So, in that sense, though, the sort of legal situation is quite common. I think similarly, you have a kind of police preoccupation in most Western countries with sort of public morals and with sexuality. This is obviously expressed in the sort of commonness of these sodomy laws across much of Europe and, of course, in the United States. You certainly have a variety of penalties in other countries that kind of are designed to keep women in line, as it were, to keep women in kind of appropriately feminine roles. And I think that's what you see both in Nazi Germany and in a lot of these other cases, is that the animus against lesbians is typically first and foremost about their role as women in patriarchal societies and a desire to make sure that women are conforming to these sort of feminine norms. These are, we shouldn't forget, these are societies where women either only recently got the right to vote or, in the 1930s still didn't have the right to vote in many countries, where women oftentimes aren't able to really own property independently, certainly not if they have a husband. They aren't able to make economic decisions for themselves independently. And so when we talk about the persecution of lesbians, it's not just about is female homosexuality criminalized or not? It's about the entire kind of misogyny of the society in question and the desire to make sure that all women, not just queer women, are kind of slotting into what the men who run the society see as the appropriate place for women.
Right. Yeah. If you don't need a man, that's very
Right.
threatening.
Right. And for the Nazis, they said, well, if a gay man is out there, he's never going to be a father. And in fact, we probably don't want him to be a father. But they said for lesbians, because essentially they didn't really see women as having independent sex drives, which again is a long-standing stereotype in Western culture. They said, well, even if a woman has had an affair with another woman, she can still become a wife and a mother and, raise good Aryan children for the Reich. Again, it all sort of comes down to this misogyny where they aren't taking women seriously as agents. They aren't taking women's sexuality seriously. And as a result, they see female homosexuality as a problem, but it's not as dire of a problem in their mind as male homosexuality.
A major driving point of the book is that queer women were victims of the Holocaust too, despite the fact that, as we've said, there were no specific laws banning female
Mhm.
homosexuality. And why do you think people find this to be a contentious topic? And I was wondering if you've noticed that this has impacted the reception of the book at all, if this is something
Mm.
people are talking about.
So there's a few things here. First of all, for a long time, there was this assertion, particularly in Germany, among activists, historians, even some politicians, that lesbians were not victims. And as you've sort of alluded to, one of the main arguments of this book is to contradict that, to say, yes, lesbians were persecuted. They were victims of the Nazis. So it took a long time, a lot of sort of spade work, in particular by, historians who started working on this topic decades ago, to show actually, yes, there were women who were investigated by the police, a few of them who were imprisoned for being lesbian. And there are a couple examples of lesbians who were sent to concentration camps as lesbians. Now, much more prevalent, as I talk about in the book, and as other scholars have also gotten into in their work, is kind of intersectional persecution, where, a queer woman is coming to the attention of the police and the police officer isn't writing down they're a lesbian, therefore they're going to a concentration camp, case closed, right? It's much more complicated than that. Maybe they're denounced for being a lesbian. The police says, okay, well, that's problematic, but it's not something we can charge them with, but we're going to look into them and find other things. And then maybe they get charged with something else. And, maybe a judge says, okay, well, if you don't clean up your act, you might be sent to a concentration camp. One of the cases that really kind of structures the book and is really one of the most important cases for my understanding of this topic is that of a young woman named Waltraud Hock. She was a Afro-German. She was sent to prison for being so-called work shy, which was another designation that the Nazis used. In general, like if you didn't want to work or you were seen as being sort of underemployed, you could be labeled as work shy and sent to prison or a workhouse or a concentration camp. So she was imprisoned for being work shy. She and her mother were both accused of being sort of oversexed, overly libidinal. Her mother was accused of being, quote, animalistically libidinal by the party. and was actually forcibly sterilized. And Waltraud was also accused of being a lesbian. And so all of these things together combined to the party saying, okay, this person is what they termed asocial and should be sent to a concentration camp. And that's exactly what happened. She was sent to Ravensbrück, which was the giant female concentration camp just north of Berlin. And from there, she was sent to Auschwitz, where she was murdered. And again, you can't look at her file and say, here is the one reason why she was persecuted. Instead, it's this intersection of all of these different reasons that conspired to make her seen by the party and by its officials as asocial. And being lesbian and being sort of sexually, in the words of the party, deviant was a big part of that. Now, the reason that it's contentious, I mean, again, there are a few reasons here. I think, first of all, it has a lot to do with, again, misogyny. This isn't something that people love to talk about, but, gay men can be misogynistic too, particularly in the kind of activist groups that cropped up in Germany starting in the early 1970s. There was a huge amount of misogyny. I wrote about this a lot in my first book. Many of the activists who I interviewed would talk about this. And one of their big points was to press for recognition of homosexual victims of Nazism. And again, it's hard to get into their heads. I think part of it is just a kind of general dismissal of women and women's history. I think part of it is also that they had an anxiety that if they kind of, in their minds, diluted their claim to have been persecuted by the Nazis by including women where there wasn't a specific law against female homosexuality, that might make those claims or their activism less kind of legitimate to the kind of heterosexual majority of West Germany. So that's a big part of it. I think in general, there's also a kind of, homophobic allergy to talking about any queer victims of the Holocaust. In fact, just a couple days ago, there was a comment on a video I did for a Holocaust museum in New York about this topic. And the person essentially said, well, everyone knows that lesbians weren't persecuted and that they weren't sent to concentration camps. But, we should go back to criminalizing them. And it was sort of this incoherent statement, but I think gets at the heart of some of the hostility here of just saying, well, we don't want to talk about these victims. We don't want to think about queer people as victims, in part because we want to keep, persecuting them today. This obviously also ties in with modern transphobia. There has started to be some resistance to thinking about trans people as victims of the Holocaust and victims of Nazism. J.K. Rowling a couple years ago, I'm forgetting the exact quote, but basically said it was, in her words, fever dream that trans people had been persecuted. We again have evidence, some of which I talk about in my book, that trans people were, in fact, persecuted, sent to concentration camps. Anyway, so that's sort of a very roundabout answer to your question, but I think there's a whole host of different sort of phobias and anxieties that sort of explain why this is a contentious topic. I've been very lucky, though, so far. Other than that one example, people generally seem very interested in this topic and very receptive to these arguments.
This might be really obvious, but how did you find out that these women were queer if there wasn't specific evidence?
So in general, I was really interested in focusing on women who came to the attention of state authorities because of their alleged queerness. And so usually, again, what I'm looking at police reports, I'm looking at court decisions, I'm looking at detectives' notes, these, interrogations of people, the sorts of records that are compiled by state authority. In all of these cases, you have to be skeptical, right? You have to read all of these sources with a kind of grain of salt or, a pile of salt. At the same time, I think you can generally piece them together and get some sort of sense of what is the truth of this situation? What's actually going on here in the absence of assuming that these police officers are simply just fabricating all of their evidence, which in general, there's a couple occasions in my research where I've come across things like that, where I think this is, just an outright fabrication. But in general, I think there's at least some truth to these things. So that still leaves the question, though, of, okay, I have evidence collected by a hostile state agency about this individual. What does that mean about kind of the truth of their identity, of how they understood themselves? And there, I'm engaging in my own kind of detective work, trying to piece together essentially circumstantial evidence to make a best case determination about how they maybe thought about themselves. I think a really good example of this is the case of Ilse Totzka. This is someone who lived in Würzburg, who is actually fairly well known as these cases go because they tried to flee with a Jewish friend of theirs into Switzerland. They ultimately were unsuccessful, but did survive the Nazi period. They are relevant for this topic because they were denounced multiple times by neighbors for a whole host of reasons, including both alleged lesbianism and for being someone born female who went out in men's clothing. Now, we don't really have any direct evidence from them about their sexual identity or their gender identity. And so what we're left with are these denunciations that describe their behavior or their alleged behavior. And so when I talk about Totska, and you'll notice I'm using they, them pronouns for them because I don't want to sort of make a assertion without evidence about what their identity was. Maybe they were a trans man, maybe they were a lesbian, maybe they identified in some other hybrid way. We just don't know. And so in those cases, I tried to exercise a degree of kind of historical humility, describe what we knew about the person, make the case that they, properly belong in a book of queer history, and then essentially leave it up to the reader to make their own determination about what they think about this individual.
Did you find any family members or just people that know them?
No. In general, I didn't go looking for family members. That can often, first of all, it can be quite difficult to track down family members. Second of all, family members don't always want to hear about this history. They don't always want to talk about this history. And the one effort that I was interested in and did a little bit with the help of my colleague Anna Haikova was to see if I could find the daughter of Waltraud Hock. I wasn't, though. And so
Makes sense.
You did so much careful, painstaking work of painting pictures of these women who otherwise would have been lost to history. So that is one reason I definitely would recommend our listeners to read your book, because if you take nothing else away, you're going to read about all these, vivid, brilliant women who once lived. And if you hadn't written this book, we wouldn't know anything about them. So I really like that.
I was really cognizant of that when I was writing. And I think that's something I try to do in all of my historical writing is bring the people I'm writing about to life in 3 dimensions and not to turn them into 2-dimensional heroes or villains, but to do my best to kind of make the reader and make myself feel like they're standing right next to me and that I could imagine having a conversation with them. And obviously that's a hard thing to do if all you have are some police interrogations with someone, but I think it's an exercise in both taking empirical evidence, but also kind of taking imagination and actually trying to build out what this person's life would have been like. So I very much appreciate you saying that.
You talk about how it's impossible to tell trans history and the history of homosexuality in isolation from one another. And after I read your book, it was, all the pieces kind of fell into place for me. So I was wondering if you could explain that to our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I really feel pretty passionately about. This isn't first and foremost a book of trans history. I really was interested in lesbian experiences. I was interested in the kind of phenomenon of female homosexuality and what the Nazi state did with it. And I'll briefly say that the sort of, I think, present day context for this is with all of the transphobia that we're facing today, there is a kind of vocal contingent, oftentimes of gay people who say, well, trans people have nothing to do with us. Trans, that's a different phenomenon. Historically, it's a different phenomenon. These are the sort of LGB without the T type people. And I politically disagree with that. But also, I think when you actually go back and look at the evidence, it is simply false to say this. And so I really wanted to impress on my readers, no, you absolutely cannot write the one without the other. And the reason for that fundamentally is that the ideas of transvestite, transsexual, gay, lesbian, homosexual, all of these are recent inventions. They're recent ideas, historically speaking, right? They are all kind of coined starting in the mid 1800s up through the kind of mid 1900s. And before that, I mean, I'm writing a global history of queerness right now. Before that, these ideas and kind of, sodomy and transing gender, I mean, there's all sorts of terms that people use in the past for this. They're very much muddled concepts, right? They flow into each other. They're not intellectually distinct. And even in the early 20th century, as you start to have a differentiation, you have the word transvestite coined in the early 20th century. You have the word homosexual, schwul, which means gay in German, lesbian, etc. They're still very much interconnected. And in some cases, there are literal individuals who identify as both a homosexual and a transvestite, such as the club promoter Lotte Hamm, who's a character in the book. In other cases, as you're reading these police reports, I mean, I've already mentioned Ilse Totska, you can't easily distinguish these two. You can't easily say, okay, this person's trans, this person's homosexual. They share social space. So I have one chapter on these fabulous balls that continued to take place in Nazi Berlin. I mean, you have these sort of really remarkable lesbian women who keep hosting giant balls of like 300 queer people in central Berlin all the way up through 1940. And at those balls, you have lesbian women, you have gay men, you have trans men, you have trans women. And again, you can't sort of neatly say, okay, well, the trans men were off in that corner and the lesbians were off in that corner. No, no, no. I mean, they were all, mixing and mingling. And again, reading these reports, you can't easily distinguish and say, this is this is that. And so I think this effort to say, okay, no, these are actually different phenomena with different histories is just completely wrongheaded and politically motivated. And so again, it was really important for me to kind of stress these histories. I think it's entirely appropriate and proper to have a history focused on lesbians. And my colleague Xavier Nunn is coming out soon with a history of trans women in Nazi Germany. I think that's totally fine. But in Xavier's book, similarly, it's not like, okay, we're only talking about trans people and we're going to pretend that homosexuality doesn't exist. I mean, that's also not the case. So these are very much intertwined and interlinked histories, both at the kind of conceptual, intellectual level and just in terms of the daily experiences of the people that we're writing about.
Man, I would love to snag an invite to one of those fabulous balls.
I know, right? I mean, that chapter was the most fun to write about. And, writing about Nazi Germany is fundamentally depressing. And so when you get to write about these sort of fabulous parties happening, it's a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's your connection to Germany?
A few. So, in terms of my own biography, my parents are both professors and they were on sabbatical at the University of Bonn in Germany in 1998. And so I lived there with them and started learning German. It was the capital at that point, and it was this sort of magical semester for me. And I just kind of fell in love with the country and the culture. I kept studying the language when I got back to the US. I eventually became a German lit major in college. Obviously, my interests have sort of shifted a bit from there, but this sort of deep interest I have in the country has remained. In terms of my longer family biography, I have this sort of strange family attachment to Germany that has nothing to do with any sort of German heritage, but my mother and her mother and her mother all studied German. I have a book of Heinrich Heine poetry from my great-grandmother. My grandmother actually lived in Germany in 1938. She was a foreign exchange student, which, height of the Nazi period. And so there's this sort of weird abiding family interest with the country and the culture. And I guess I'm sort of the latest expression of that.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. And, again, this sort of goes back to your question about what sort of personal investments people have. Because on the one hand, I do think you don't need to belong to like a group. Like I don't need to be German to write about Germany. At the same time, there usually is a reason why people write about the things that they do, right? And there's usually some kind of personal investment that they have. And so people, accurately assume I'm a gay man, but then sort of inaccurately will assume that I'm from Germany. And then I sort of have to explain to them, no, I have all these other reasons why I'm interested in the country.
I did wonder briefly if your name had like Germanic influences in it as well.
Yes. So my last name is German. That side of the family came over to the US like a century and a half ago. And the Hunekes are, as far as I know, from a small village outside of Bremen. It's not a super common name. Every once in a while, I'll come across another person with the same name, but it's not typical.
When I read about queer people voting for Hitler in 1933, I thought about how it's quite common for people to assume that queer people are a left-wing monolith, I think especially in this day and age, when in reality, not all queer people see their identity as interwoven with progressive politics. Do you think those voters who voted for Hitler viewed it as voting against their self-interest in some ways, but that it would be worthwhile in other ways? Or did they maybe not perceive that they themselves would be in danger?
They were voting for the leopards eating people's faces party. I think it varies from person to person. I think this idea we have that sexuality defines political preference is actually a very recent vintage. I write about that in my first book. I've written essays about this as well. It really is, I think, a product of intentional activism to convince queer people that they ought to vote based on their sexual identity. And the success of those movements really only kind of bears fruit in like the 80s, 90s up to the present. So at that point, there's just no kind of overarching agreement. And also what gay rights movements or homosexual rights movements exist in the 1920s and early 30s, they don't have the reach or the membership or the sort of name cachet to actually convince Germany's queer people to vote a certain way. And so that's why you find this incredibly fragmented voting landscape where a bunch of them are social democrats or communists. They're voting, for these parties that are kind of sexually progressive. But then around a third of voters who were polled by one of these groups were adherents of right wing or far right parties that were certainly hostile to their interests as queer people. I think most likely they didn't see their voting interests as having anything to do with their sexual preference. Either that or they just thought, okay, I'm in favor of these parties for other reasons, and those are more important to me than the sodomy law. I think what's interesting about the Nazis specifically is although the Nazis were never, they never went out and said, yeah, we're pro-gay, we're pro-homosexual. That never happened. But there was nonetheless a perception among many people that they were kind of tacitly friendly to queer people, in part or in large part because of Ernst Röhm, who was the head of the Nazi SA, the Nazi stormtroopers, the paramilitary, a close personal friend of Hitler's. And he was, I wouldn't say an out gay man, but an outed gay man, right? In 1932, the Social Democratic Party printed sort of romantic letters of his in an attempt to embarrass the Nazi Party and to embarrass Hitler specifically. And at that point, Hitler basically stood by him. He wasn't ousted from the party. And so many people sort of had this idea that Nazism was secretly a kind of gay movement. This then seeps into communist thinking in particular. There are Soviet thinkers who say, well, basically homosexuality and fascism are the same thing. And in that case, they're not just looking at these one-off examples of gay Nazis, but they're actually looking at the kind of overarching homoerotic, homosocial nature of fascism, right? If you look at fascist posters, they tend to be quite homoerotic. When you look at the structure of fascist parties and paramilitaries, it's all dudes, it's all men, right? And you can sort of imagine what's going on there in the barracks. And so I think there were certainly people who probably were voting for the Nazis in part because they thought the Nazis aligned with their other political views, and they didn't actually see the Nazis as being particularly hostile to homosexuality.
Dear pick-me's, you will never be picked.
Yes. But as a historian, I generally don't try to second guess or make moral judgments about the people I'm writing about. Now, if we're talking about people who perpetrated the Holocaust, I'm perfectly happy to make moral judgments. But if we're talking about who ordinary Germans were voting for in 1933, I think that's a harder thing to do. I mean, it's very easy for us to sit back in 2026 and say, well, I never would have voted for the Nazi Party. But, who knows? I mean, and this is something I try to get across to my students when I'm teaching this material is, Germany was a highly educated, highly functional society. And over a third of the country, ordinary people who did not see themselves as bigoted, anti-Semite, genocide mongering individuals still voted for Hitler and the Nazi Party. And I think, again, it's very much worthwhile to try and understand why they did so, but it generally isn't helpful to sort of assume a kind of moral high horse position and say, well, I never would have done that, and these people were clearly evil. So it's sort of an uncomfortable thing to do when looking at history. And the converse side of that is I also try to be very honest about the people who I do see as sort of heroes or heroic or remarkable, and how they also had to at times make decisions that might make us uncomfortable or not sort of sit well with us today.
I think people often kind of forget what you would lose too if you didn't vote for the Nazi Party. Like, you could lose anything from your reputation to your career to your land, lots of things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm also talking more about the kind of the last free elections where there wouldn't necessarily have been that pressure. But I mean, certainly later on, where you have like 90% of people, 99% of people voting for Hitler, they're absolutely. But I think, even in the March 1933 elections where the terror has started, Hitler has become chancellor. I mean, what's remarkable about that is there's immense pressure on voters to vote for the Nazi Party. And they only get like 43% of the vote at that point, despite the fact that these are not free or fair elections. And so again, I think, conversely, it's very interesting to try and figure out, well, what gives people the courage to behave in that way. But again, in all of these cases, I think the job of a historian is to try and take people as they are, and sort of starting from a place of moral condemnation rarely allows us to do that.
So earlier you already brought up Ernst Röhm and how initially Hitler stood by him. Can you tell us a little bit about how that changed and why afterward the fact that he was a homosexual was weaponized in a way?
So, I mean, Röhm is this really fascinating character. He's a veteran of the First World War, as were many Nazis and people who joined the Nazi Party. And for him, again, he actually sees a connection between his wartime service, his homosexuality, fascism. To him, this sort of homoerotically charged, all male atmosphere of the front parallels the kind of fascist paramilitary. And moreover, unlike today, where we say, okay, if you're gay, that means you're progressive, that means you're a feminist, that means all these other things. For a lot of, sort of queer men in this period, being homoerotically inclined, desiring other men makes you more masculine than straight people. It is seen as extra manly because you don't want to be around women. All you want to do is sort of, bro out with your other veteran buds. And, these people tend to be deeply misogynistic, deeply racist. And so again, for Röhm and a bunch of the people like him, they see a sort of intimate connection between buying into fascism and their kind of desire for other men. So Röhm is the head of the SA. Hitler takes power in 1933 and essentially very quickly kind of comes to an accommodation with many of the traditional elites. So he comes to an accommodation with big industrialists and bankers. He comes to an understanding with the military, which is sort of still run by old guard elites, and settles into governing. And the problem with Röhm and the SA is that they are street brawlers, they're rabble rousers, and they were immensely effective in getting the Nazi Party into power in the first place. But once they've taken power and they are now setting about governing, they're kind of useless. They don't really have much to do. At the same time, they have swelled immensely. By 1934, there's about 4 million members of the SA. A lot of these are also former socialists and communists, and so oftentimes they're called beefsteaks. The reason being they're brown on the outside, brown being the color of Nazism, and red on the inside, meaning they're secretly communists. And so they are sort of calling increasingly for what they call a second revolution. The Nazis are in power. They now want to sort of nationalize the banks, nationalize industry. They want the SA to essentially take the place of the army. And obviously, if you're the leader of the military, you're a big banker, you're a big industrialist, you don't like the sound of this. And Hitler and other leading Nazis are very aware of this. And so they essentially decide, okay, we've got to put a stop to this rabble rousing. And in late June, early July of 1934, there's essentially an internal party purge of Röhm and other people like him in the SA, sort of cutting off the head of the SA leadership. Röhm himself is arrested at a gathering of SA leaders. He's taken to Dachau concentration camp, given the opportunity to kill himself. When he doesn't take it, two SS officers murder him. Now, this is a huge, wide-ranging purge. It also catches up other political enemies of Hitler. The current vice chancellor, Franz von Papen, he is arrested. Some of his aides are killed there. The former chancellor, Kurt Schleicher, is murdered along with his wife. And so it's this huge, wide-ranging purge. It's not the sort of thing that the Nazis can just keep a lid on. And so Hitler has to go to parliament, which is now Nazified, and explain himself. And what he does is he says that Röhm was not just gay, and the other leaders of the SA were not just gay, but that they were actively pursuing essentially a gay conspiracy to overthrow the government. And this again sounds totally bananas to us today, but it becomes this really important element of Nazi homophobia. That essentially queer people are inherently cliquish, they're conspiratorial, and given the chance, they will overthrow the government. And if you're familiar, this is very similar to kind of this homophobia that informed the Lavender Scare during the Cold War in the US and in other countries, where lots of government employees are purged for being gay on the theory that they might be spies. So it's, again, a very similar kind of homophobia. And again, this really kind of informs what the Nazis think about queer people. It informs a revision that they make to paragraph 175 2 years later, where they make it much easier to get convictions and they sort of expand the range of punishments available. And it also has to do with why they decide not to criminalize female homosexuality, because they basically say women in fascist Germany don't have a public role. They, don't have prominent political roles. They're not members of the military or the paramilitaries. And they, therefore, even if you have like lesbian cliques, they don't pose any kind of political threat to the Nazi order.
That does make a lot of sense. I didn't even think about the fact that he spun it in that way to say, look, they are going to overthrow us.
Right. This is entirely fabricated, right? This is entirely made up as a way of justifying a political purge. But then it becomes very real in Nazi propaganda. And it becomes very real in the way that Nazis talk about homosexuality. And I mean, what's sort of ironic is decades later, as I talk about in my earlier book, it sort of becomes real in a way where I found evidence that Cold War spy agencies started recruiting gay men in Cold War Berlin because they thought that they were inherently conspiratorial and therefore would make good, intelligence agents. And so again, it's sort of how ideas can take on a life of their own.
And if anyone wants to read more about the Purge, it was known as the Night of the Long Knives, correct?
Yes, exactly.
Yes. It's very depressing, though. So
Yes.
buckle in.
It is. I mean, all of this is deeply depressing. And I actually oftentimes find this when I'm teaching courses in queer history. I think oftentimes students will enroll thinking that it's all going to be, like the movie Milk or something. It's going to be uplifting and optimistic. And in fact, a lot of it is just histories of persecution and violence. And it's very grim and depressing.
You mentioned in your book 2 women who were being interrogated by the police about their relationship, and one of them said that in spite of the prohibition of the 2 of them working together by their employer, quote, "We have not abandoned each other because we love each other." Of course, the title of the book is I Will Not Abandon You, and I thought that was really powerful. So why was it important to you that rather than simply being a history of suffering, as we just mentioned, there's quite a lot of that, this book is also about resistance and hope?
So a few reasons. First is the fact that so much of queer history is a history of violence and persecution and can be really depressing. I really didn't want this book to leave the reader feeling hopeless, especially given the current moment that we're living through. I also think in general, when we're writing about periods like the Nazi period, it's important not to fall into the trap of assuming that simply because people were living under a violent authoritarian regime, they had no choice, right? This is, in fact, an excuse that many Germans gave after the war, where they said, we didn't have a choice, we couldn't have resisted, don't look to us. And historians over decades have shown, well, no, that's actually not true. People who engaged, who were perpetrators in the Holocaust absolutely had choices. There is no recorded evidence of someone refusing to participate in mass murder in the Nazi period and being punished for it. So absolutely, people had choices. Now, I'm mostly not talking about perpetrators of the Holocaust, but the same principle applies. I wanted to show or unearth how these women, whoever they were, however they were being treated by the government, had choices. And they were able to make consequential choices about their own lives as well as the lives of the people around them. And then ultimately, that sort of gets back to my commitment as a historian of trying to bring to life the people who I'm writing about. I don't think it serves our interests in the past to depict people as sort of 2-dimensional straw men. And so again, what that means is there's a lot of discomfort with these people because in some cases they are both resisting and engaging in Nazi rhetoric. There's a case that I talk about of a woman who ran a sanatorium and used it to create this sort of, little lesbian subculture in countryside outside of Berlin. At the same time, she was a Nazi party member. And it seems to me very plausible that she might have been involved in the so-called euthanasia program of murdering disabled patients. And so, again, I didn't want to sort of decide, okay, this person's a hero, this person's a villain, and ignore choice, ignore the sort of complexities of their lives. And so for all of those reasons, it was, again, really sort of at the core of this book to make sure it wasn't just a history of persecution and of victimhood, but also a history of choice and agency.
You've talked to us about a number of women already from your book, but I wonder, are there any other favorites of yours that you want to talk about or that were really fun to research or anything like that?
I think my other favorite couple who have been with me since the beginning, since I first came across these 4 files in 2015, are Marta Haluza and Margot Liu. And I don't want to sort of ruin their entire story, But basically, in a nutshell, Margot was a Jewish woman. Marta was a so-called Aryan. They had been in a relationship since before Hitler came to power. And sort of one of the turning points in their relationship is in 1941. The Holocaust proper has begun at this point. The Star of David has been introduced. And Margot gets summons that she is going to be deported to the East in a couple months. And of course, they know what this means. And so Margot meets a Chinese man, which already is extraordinary because there's about 1,600 Chinese citizens living in Germany at this point. And she's a quick thinker. She starts wooing him. And she was, a bombshell. They were both dancers. And they start going out on his birthday, October 11th. They consummate the relationship. And the next day, Margot comes to him and says, "I've missed my period. I'm pregnant. I'm going to kill myself if you don't marry me." And so he very dutifully goes out and buys 2 rings and proposes, and they convince a local bureaucrat to marry them the day that Margot is supposed to be deported. And this gives her Chinese citizenship, which protects her from deportation. Now, you might think, okay, great. Her husband, this Chinese waiter, he is understandably kind of confused when that night, their wedding night, Margot never comes home and she spends the night with Marta. And then eventually, when she does move in with him, she brings Marta with her, and the 3 of them share a bed together. And then they start moving to try and escape him and eventually sort of go underground, and he can't find them. And then he sues for divorce. And eventually this is how the case winds up in front of the Berlin criminal police. And that's how I first found it. And I won't ruin what happens to them after that, but they, I think, are one of the most remarkable sets of characters in the whole book. And again, really important for my own understanding of queer experiences under fascism.
Another reason for people to read your work.
Their story is ultimately a happy one.
Thank you.
I love it. I love it how it's like, yes, queer people have always been here and we have endured, and these women had this relationship, but also women have always been a hot mess. I loved reading
Yes.
about it. It was so entertaining.
Part of trying to make this comprehensible and bring it to life for people and make it relatable to people's experiences today, right? I mean, you think, oh, these are maybe people like I could be friends with. These are not so very different from some of the people I know, is to kind of make people aware that what these historical figures were dealing with is not so very different from what we are also dealing with in our own time. And I mean, my sister-in-law was reading this and texted me and said, I'm really mad at you because you keep talking about all these things that the Nazi government did, and I keep drawing parallels with today. And I thought, yeah, well, that's part of the point. But then reading about people like Marta and Margot, my hope is it gives you energy and gumption and courage to go out and actually, that you're not just going to sort of sit up in your house and be afraid of doing anything. So again, I really hope it doesn't just make people smile or laugh or feel depressed, but that this book gives people at least some modicum of courage and hope.
It's perspective, I think, too.
Yeah.
That where there's darkness, there's also always light. And I think that's the hopeful thing.
Yes.
You've already briefly mentioned something you were working on currently. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now?
Yeah. So I'm about 2/3 of the way through my next book, which is tentatively titled Queer: A History of the World, a small, modest project. It goes all the way from the ancient world up to the present day, and at least aspires to kind of tell the reader how queerness, and I specifically mean transing gender, so people who, through a variety of means and methods and attempts, lived as a kind of different gender than their birth gender, and homoerotic desire, and how these two things have changed over the course of human history, how they have been embedded in different civilizations and cultures and societies, and how at times they've, played really important roles in those societies. So I'm hoping that manuscript will be done in about a year, and then it should hopefully be published a year after that. So you can look out in, sort of summer or fall of 2028 for that book to be hitting shelves.
That's amazing. How long did this book take you to research and write, by the way?
This is a book that has been gestating for a while. And unlike I Will Not Abandon You, this really comes out of my teaching. I have a graduate seminar on global queer history, basically, and have taught it many times. I also took a course like it as a graduate student. And sort of as a result of reading and teaching all of these different texts, I both sort of came to my own kind of view of how this history is shaped and how it changes. And then at a certain point, I thought to kind of apply it to the moment we're living through today. I think there's understandably a lot of fear that queer people have, particularly trans people, but not just trans people, about this current moment. It feels very ahistorical, right? Because for most of our lives, at least in the US and Western Europe, we've been living through this sort of trajectory of greater rights. I mean, for my entire life up until fairly recently, this history was one of one gain after another. And when you're living through it, it feels irreversible. It feels like, the arc of moral justice is finally bending in the right direction. And I think in response to that fear and anxiety that I also feel, I wanted to historicize it and essentially tell people, no, in fact, this very much fits into the long history of queerness and how societies and governments have treated queer people and how queer people have responded, both as a way of kind of tempering our own expectations and being aware that no gain, no granting of rights is irreversible or eternal, but at the same time to give us hope that these things are temporary, that things will turn back again, and that we shouldn't lose hope for a better future.
To almost close us out on this fabulous interview, are there any World War II books, maybe that you discovered in your research, that you would recommend to people to read next, after your own book, obviously?
Yes. There are two that really spring to mind. The first, my colleague Anna Haikova, who I mentioned earlier, also recently came out with a fabulous book specifically about queer people in the Holocaust. So specifically sort of queer experiences in the camps, called People Without History Are Dust. It's a short, lovely, also depressing at times read that I definitely recommend to people. And then the other that did a lot to help me sort of grapple with the Holocaust and what we know and what we don't know and what we think we know about the Holocaust is my colleague Dan Stone's Holocaust and Unfinished History, that really is sort of remarkable in that it doesn't try, or it sort of intentionally doesn't try to draw pat, easily digestible morals from the Holocaust. I mean, I think it really sits with the moral horror of the Holocaust and resists efforts now that we're, getting close now to a century on from the rise of the Nazis. There's oftentimes efforts to kind of reduce the Holocaust and to come up with kind of easy takeaways. There's some museums that sort of tell people who visit, like, you should be a resistor, or, you should stand up. And he really, I think, wants his readers to sit with the calamity of it. There's a lot in it. So that I would also recommend.
Thank you. Maybe a little bit of a side quest, but we also watch a lot of World War II movies and shows and all that. Do you know of any queer stories about World War II that's on film?
There's a famous book that was turned into a movie, M.A. and Jaguar, about a lesbian couple in Nazi Berlin. So there's that. I'm sure there are other ones that are not springing to mind, but that's the one that immediately comes to mind.
I think the only hint of it we saw so far has been in the satirical one. In Jojo Rabbit, I think there's a queer character. At the end, it's kind of revealed that
Okay.
he's queer. But other than that, I don't think we've seen much of it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like World War II as a topic tends to be a very sort of heterosexual topic, at least how it's sort
Yes.
of portrayed in popular culture.
Yes, that, and very masculine as well. Like,
Yes.
women in general are also not as heavily featured.
Yes. Very much so.
Yes, we often watch movies and we're like, give that woman something to do. Why is she just like a half stand?
They what is it, the Bechdel test? That
Yeah.
they
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll probably check that movie out because we've been jonesing to do some kind of queer story. I have a copy of the book coming out, Under Fire, that I haven't read, but it's been on my list forever. So I'm like,
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
yeah.
Excellent.
First of all, I'm going to thank you for being on the podcast with us.
Yes, thanks for having me. This was great.
Thank you again for listening to yet another episode of Rosie the Reviewer. You can follow us wherever you get your podcasts. You can rate us 5 stars. We would appreciate it very much. You can send this episode to a friend, and you should. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, or you can visit our website, rosiereviewer.com, for more information, and I will put all of the links to the book on the website as well if you want to go give that a read. And a buy, please do. And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye.